560, The Answer.
64 at O'Hare. Next news, 8:30. Chicago's Morning Answer continues now on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Well, this was a fun little interview that Nancy Pelosi gave to a journalist from Semaphore. In case you were wondering what the established spin is, the official spin from the central office on the installation of Kamala to replace Biden, the criticisms that Democrats are the vanguards of democracy, but they don't practice what they preach within their own party. Nancy has an answer for that, and it's a screamer.
You had reportedly said you wanted a sort of an open primary if Joe Biden stepped down. Did you change your mind because you saw all the excitement around Kamala Harris?
No, I didn't change my mind. We had an open primary, and she won it. Nobody else got in the race because she was politically astute. And but that was the thought. Let's show our talent. We have a great bench, all these great people in the country. And the president endorsed her. Yes, people could have jumped in. There were some people who were sort of preparing, but she just took off with it. And actually, it was a blessing because there wasn't that much time between then and the election, and it sort of saved time. So it wasn't that we didn't have an open process. It's just that nobody got in because she had a running start.
Oh, I mean, what a sack of lies. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Nancy Pelosi was on CNN and saying disparaging remarks about Kamala Harris and Biden's choice to pick her as the vice president. She wasn't happy with it.
Well, it was a blessing. Just serendipitous. Worked out that way, but she just built a better mousetrap, did Kamala, when it came to that open process. Sure.
There's no open process.
I can tell you that the good news is that the Democrats have as much concern for election integrity with respect to the general election as they do with respect to the replacement of a candidate for their party. Exactly the same respect for election integrity. You heard it right there from Nancy Pelosi. Ooh. Fred Lucas is a manager of the investigative reporting project for the Daily Signal. He's also the author of the new book, The Myth of Voter Suppression. Fred, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
And before we get to voter suppression specifically, I mean, I'll give you an opportunity to take a swing at what Nancy Pelosi had to say about the open process.
Well, it was fairly ridiculous. I mean, yeah, it did come out, I think, in a Wall Street Journal interview, like right around the convention time, that she said she wanted an open process, and she largely took credit for pushing Biden out. But I mean, we did see an interview. Gavin Newsom had even mocked the fact that it wasn't an open process.
Yes, right.
And everybody knows Gavin Newsom was hoping to jump in there and be the guy, the heir apparent to Joe Biden, because as everyone that has a pulse remembers, the only reason Joe Biden was even running for another term for a long time was because Democrats thought that there was no way they could win with Kamala Harris.
Right, exactly. But Gavin Newsom, real quick, he wasn't, I don't know what's going on with him, but he didn't even get a Tuesday noon slot at the 18,000 encampments, and those tents are going to all be gone.
Well, the other thing is, too, if you put him in a...
They were on for Xi's visit, so...
Yeah, well, we got to prepare for company, sure. But the other thing is, if you give Newsom a prime slot, and you say, well, that guy's even slimier than Kamala Harris, he should be our nominee. So you don't want the competition. Speaking of elections generally, so this book, The Myth of Voter Suppression. Tell us. I I think we sort of understand all this idea that the voter ID is preventing anybody from voting is ridiculous. There are like no stories. There are real stories about voter fraud. There are no stories about a specific person who is prevented by another specific person from exercising their franchise. But I mean, just in terms of the intricacies associated under the heading election integrity, what should people understand, particularly perhaps as it relates to battleground states?
Well, yeah, in battleground states, we had a story yesterday, went up on dailysignal.com regarding how even some on the left are how they lauded mail-in balloting so much in 2020. Now there's even a few Democratic officials who are worried about it, that think the Postal Service is not prepared for this. And I write quite a bit about that in The Myth of Voter Suppression, how a lot of the, whatever you say about the 2020 election, I mean, obviously there were some, didn't go great, but there were a lot of things thrown out there that weren't provable. What is provable is that there were election rules that were changed, election rules about when ballots had to be postmarked by and so forth, and battleground states like Pennsylvania. A lot of those things are being cleaned up this year. At least in Arizona, Georgia, we've got some election reform laws that passed actually in 2021 to clean that up. Even Pennsylvania banned Zuckerbucks. So
and recently in Pennsylvania, they said you dated and unsigned absentee ballots will not be counted or should not be counted.
Yeah, right. But then there was also some litigation over that, so we're going to see where that goes before the election. But yeah, so I mean there is some risk about mail-in balloting, but it does seem that some of the issues that we saw in 2020 probably won't repeat themselves in 2024, but maybe new issues will come about.
And so the left's opposition, we saw this yesterday in the continuing resolution that would have included in the House that failed, which would have included a voter ID requirement. The left story about enfranchisement, because they don't talk really about ballot integrity. They're always talking about enfranchisement, and you're making it more difficult to vote, and you're preventing people from voting. I mean, again, I sort of offered a conclusion about that, but let's give your perspective as somebody who's done more research on it than me.
Well, yeah, this is something a story I've got coming up, and the Daily Signal is going to be looking at these battleground states and the number of voting age non-citizens there. Now, there's almost 800,000 voting age non-citizens in the state of Georgia. That's the largest number. About 800,000 in North Carolina. Interesting, those both have larger non-citizen populations in Arizona, which is a border state. They have about 600,000. Pennsylvania, a little over 500,000. But I think the big point here is that past research has shown about 6.4% of non-citizens have voted in presidential elections. If you have 6% of those, of that many people, of 800,000 people voting, that could swing some of these swing states that are decided by 10,000, 20,000 votes. So that's something to keep an eye on. And particularly, we see why Democrats might have been so passionate to oppose the SAVE Act.
Well, right. And speaking of Arizona, you mentioned the Maricopa County Recorder's Office just reported this week nearly 100,000 Arizonans have registered to vote in the 2024 election without providing proof of citizenship. Now, they don't have to, but some of them may be citizens. You just don't have to provide it, so it's not provided. But it certainly is an area of concern, and it necessitates some ballot integrity infrastructure on the, perhaps some litigation ahead of the election and some ballot integrity infrastructure in the form of poll watchers and lawyers and such.
Right. And what we're going to see, particularly if Trump wins, if Democrats lose, they are going to say this was voter suppression. They're going to say these voter ID laws suppress voting. They're going to claim that removing the names of dead people from voter rolls suppress the vote and so
Suppress
forth.
the vote of the dead.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's never been a problem in Chicago, has it?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, the fact is, there's clear proof, clear evidence of past election results that were flipped because of voter fraud. This has often been U.S. House races or local elections. Usually, the more local, the more likely they are to be flipped by fraud. And there's been people who have gone to jail for voter fraud, adjudicated cases. As you mentioned earlier, however, to contrast that, as much as voter suppression has been a great soundbite for Democrats because it harkens back to a really bad time in American history, in modern times, they cannot point to a plaintiff who can say, I tried to vote and was prevented from doing so.
Yeah, and in fact, the evidence, I mean, where it's been most bandied about, I mean, I could go back to the special elections in Georgia for Senate, and just the whole that whole saga in 2020 and slightly beyond. Stacey Abrams, because she was sort of a national figurehead for this voter suppression, they're suppressing the black vote, and then you had like historic black turnout. Both in the 2020 presidential and as well as in the special elections for the Senate. So, I mean, all the evidence is to the contrary. They have no evidence to support their claim. So they just run around saying, any sort of reform is Jim Crow 2.0, which is exactly what Biden said. Voter ID is the modern day poll tax and all of this other nonsense. And I don't know. I mean, they seem to get away with it, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's really shameful to say that. I mean, you use that kind of rhetoric, right? It's those are Jim Crow 1.0 was really a sort of an apartheid state in the southern states, and that was just a really horrible time. It's like comparing an inconvenient situation to war or something along those lines. It's you can't compare showing ID to that, and then most people don't mind. That's one thing about voter ID. It polls extremely well, around 80%. Among all the population, and among 60-70% among African Americans and other minorities, and even really high among actual rank and file Democratic voters. So rank and file Democratic voters, you just ask a person on the street, they don't see a problem with voter ID, but it's Democratic politicians and operatives that don't like it.
Yeah, and some scaredy cat, not to invoke Springfield, Ohio, but scaredy cat Republicans, too, that are afraid of being called a racist, and so they'll do anything to not be called a racist, however illegitimately.
Yeah. And you did see an unfortunate number of Republicans bailed just to get any funding bill yesterday on that CR without passing the SAVE Act.
Exactly. Fred Lucas, manager of the Investigative Reporting Project for the Daily Signal, dailysignal.com, and the author of The Myth of Voter Suppression. Fred, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on the show, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.